Hey guys, it's Protostar, and today I'm going to be walking you through a bass in PhasePlant, and this is in conjunction with Kilohearts and with Subpack. So I'm going to be using my S2, which is on the back of my chair, instead of my M2X, because I use my S2 for producing in the studio. And just as an example, this is the sound that we're going to be making today. And I'll be going over my thought processes and tips and tricks on how I kind of approach these kind of basses and just general sound design. All right, to start off, I'm going to pull up a PhasePlant, and then I'm going to open it up. I'm going to pull up a wavetable, and I'm going to go straight to screams and crunch, because I know that's what I used for this. Choosing the right wavetable is actually a big part of creating the right sound in this kind of bass. So if we listen to the sound on its own, it's quite basic. Basically just a square wave. Now, if we want to add some movement on it, you see this frame value here. If we move this up and down, you can see it starts to add some movement to it. So this is where we're looking through the frames of the wavetable. Now, to modulate that, you can do plenty of different things. The beauty of PhasePlant is that you have this whole window down here to add as many modulators to modulate anything you want, really. You can even modulate modulators. So to start off with, we're just going to click down here, and we're going to add an envelope. Now what we want to do is we want to map that envelope up here to the frame. So that basically what it's going to do is that when you press the key down, the envelope is going to track through the waveform in a certain way, and it will do that every time you press the key. You could also map an LFO, and then you would have that repeat over and over again, but it just depends on what kind of style of bass you want. So to start off, what we're going to do is we're going to press this yellow button here, which allows us to then map this envelope to whatever we want. So we're going to set it to frame, and we're going to put the envelope up to 100%. Now if you press the key on the keyboard, as you can see, it's very quick, and it just kind of goes up to the maximum, and then that's it, and it holds. And that's because we haven't really done anything with the envelope. As you can see, that the envelope has an attack, it has a sustain, and we don't really want the sustain to just sit at 100. We're going to want to choose where that kind of level is. So let's just have a play around with it. As you can see, the attack and decay values are pretty much what will give you that characteristic movement, whereas the sustain will tell the wavetable what frame to freeze on when it gets to that point. So if we have a quicker decay, I can show that. As you can see, it's freezing at that frame there. One thing that I do want to do though is I want to go onto this button here, and I want to change this from unipolar to inverted. All that's going to do is switch it so that the 0 point starts at the top, and then the 1 is down here. So now when I play it, you're going to hear that it starts at the higher end of the wavetable, and then it comes back down and then up again. The values I used for the envelope were 199 for the attack, 10.2 for the hold, 521 for decay, sustain at 0, and release at 343. So now that we got some movement on the space, I want to add some movement on the stereo field. So we're going to add this effect called ensemble, and we're going to leave it at 6 voices. Now, if we listen to what it does to the bass now, you're going to hear that it's going to add some movement in that stereo field. But we don't want it to be so full on at the start. We're going to want to automate this in as it goes along. So we're going to add another envelope down here, and we're going to automate some parameters on this ensemble. So again, press this yellow plus sign on the right-hand side of the new envelope, and we're going to go map this to the mix. Now the value that we assign to this is going to be completely up to you, but for the purposes of this bass, I had it at 68%. All this is going to do is it's going to automate the value of the mix on the ensemble, so it starts off drier and ends up with a more full effect at the end. After that, we want to map the mix down all the way to 0, and that way the envelope can then increase the value of the mix. So if we press the key now and watch the mix knob here, you'll see that it goes up as the envelope gets triggered. That's a bit too fast. Basically, all that I'm looking to do is to create a slow slope on the mix and the detune. So we're going to increase the attack time here. And we don't really need a decay because we're going to have it just sustain. So we can bring the decay all the way down to 0. We're also going to make this curve a bit more exponential rather than linear, so that it kind of comes in a bit slower and then ends up speeding up at the end. So we're going to pull down on the waveform here just to bring that in. If we listen to the bass now, this is what it sounds like. You can hear how it starts off dry, but then ends up really wet and quite wide with that ensemble kicking in. We can do the same thing with the detune, but I want to add another envelope because I just want a slightly longer curve on that, because I want the mix to fully kick in and then it's slightly detune after that. So we're going to go ahead and click here and create a new envelope. And it's going to be basically the same job here. Just click on the yellow plus assign it to detune, and we're going to put this one at 100%. And we're going to bring down the detune to 13% here. And then I'm just going to set my attack to 1.9 seconds because that's what I had before. And we're going to have the same kind of curve here as well. But we've got a bit more of an exponential curve going on. Now this is what it sounds like. Next up, we're going to add a Fft. Fft is a great saturation plugin, but it also has this nice stereo effect to it. So we're going to add that to kind of emphasize some of those features. So click in lane 1 just below the ensemble, and we're going to add Fft here. If we listen to how it is now, it's going to be a bit too crunchy for my liking. So if we listen here, what we're going to do is going to bring down the drive, and then we're going to also automate the mix just how we did the mix on the ensemble just before. So I'm going to bring the drive down to 30%. Just so it's not as hot. And then we're also going to bring the mix down to 25-24% just so that it's not as strong at the start as well. And again, on the envelope that we just made, we're going to hit the plus sign and we're going to assign it to mix. We're going to set this one to 100%. And then we're also going to automate the stereo turbo a bit. We're going to click here, but we're only going to put it up to around 2%. Now if we listen, it's going to be very slight, but you're going to hear the distortion start to increase as the sound goes on. Okay, so now that we've added the distortion and we've added the ensemble, I want to clean up the low end because I don't want all of that stereo information on the lows. So we're going to cut out the low end and we're going to add in our own sub. So I'm going to click under the Fft and I'm going to add a slice EQ right here. I'm going to open it up and then I'm going to add in a high pass right here. I'm going to click on the filters part on the right hand side to see exactly what we're working with, and I'm going to bring this up to a 24 dB filter, and then I'm going to bring the cutoff right up to like around 120 Hertz. Because that's kind of where the roll off for most sub is going to start if you're going to want to add in your own sub. Now, you know, this will change from bass to bass depending on how much low mid information there is, but this is kind of a good rule of thumb to sort of start with, and then you can play around with it once you've, you know, got a sub pack or something, and you can feel where the muddiness is going to start to kick in when your sub and your bass are interacting a bit too much. Now if we listen to this and you're listening on good speakers, headphones, or a sub pack, you're going to feel that there's no low end, aside from maybe some residual low end bleeding from the low mids. That's feeling pretty clean to me now. I'm going to add in the sub. So right under the first group, we're going to add a second group by clicking and then going to utilities and then group. And we're going to add a wavetable. Now you could use an analog oscillator here, but I want to use a wavetable because I want to play with the harmonics in the sub. So I'm going to click on the wavetable drop down here, and I'm going to go down to signs, and I want to click raw harmonics. So as you can see in the wavetable view here, there's a lot of different multiples of this sine wave, but I only picked this just because I want to be able to edit the waveform of the original. So if we click on this pen tool here, it's going to open the wavetable editor. And what we're mainly interested in is the Fft Editor down here. This is where we're going to add in the harmonics. So on the left side of the wavetable editor, we want to click on this pen tool here. This allows us to edit the harmonics here. And as you can see down here, we've got the phase as well of all the harmonics. I'm going to double click on these just to reset them down to 0 because I want to make sure everything in this range is going to be in phase, just to make sure. Now you only have to do this for the first 5 or so because we're not going to be adding too many harmonics here. So my general rule of thumb when it comes to adding harmonics on the sub is that the second harmonic here generally adds a bit too much muddiness into a sound, and then the third and fourth, these are where the kind of warmth of subs comes from. So these are the main ones we're going to focus on, and then the rest is just going to be adding more color to it. If I go ahead and pull up span, for example, we're going to be able to see what we're doing when we're working with this sub. Just going back to the synth, what we want to make sure is that this has got an output as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to click underneath it and go utilities and then output. And we also want to make sure that we're sending this to lane 2 because we don't want to use the same kind of stereo effects and also end up cutting out the sub on this oscillator because then it won't make any sense. So all that's going to do is it's going to send oscillator 1 through to lane 1, which then goes to lane 2. Oscillator 2 then goes to lane 2, which then merges, you know, with the stuff that's been processed in lane 1, and then that goes up to lane 3. So you can follow the kind of flow in these lanes here. You can route them to whatever you want. So now that that's routed, we can also mute lane 1 so that we can just work on the sub, or we could just turn off the group here. So clicking on the pen tool to reopen the wavetable editor, we're going to have a look at what this sine wave looks like now. So if I press just an F here, see that it's one harmonic. Now if I go up a few octaves so that's a bit clearer, see, that's the fundamental. Now if I click on the pencil here and then draw in a second harmonic, a third, a fourth, just like that, if I play it now, you can start to see those harmonics coming in. And if I go up a few octaves again, you can really see each individual one. Now the rule of thumb for subs is that the fundamental should generally be sitting from 30 to 60 Hertz. That's the range that you really want to be sitting in. You can go above that, you know, into the 80s and like closer to 100, but you generally don't want your main fundamental notes of your song to be in that range because it's a bit too high, but it's okay to go there every so often. So I'm just going to add in some harmonics here and just kind of play around with it and just test to see how warm it sounds. You know, I might not want too much harmonic content around the 5th here. That sounds good. Now to just demonstrate what I mean about the second harmonic and how that can kind of screw up a sub bass, if I bring this up here, listen to how it sounds more like a bass guitar now than a sub. But if I bring it all the way down again, you have that definition on that fundamental that really makes it nice and clean. So again, I'm just going to double click these just to make sure they're in phase, and our sub is done. Now if we re-add the first oscillator, this is what it's going to sound like. Sounds cool, but it's a bit static on the low end now. Also, a quick tip on the wavetable editor, changing the level of the fundamental is going to change how loud the sub is generally. So just be careful with that. So the last feature that I think we're going to add is an LFO. So I'm going to minimize all these envelopes here because we don't really need to look at them right now. And we're going to click and we're going to add an LFO. Now I want to just do a simple volume LFO. There's other more complicated techniques you can do, like key tracking the rate of the LFO so that the higher up you go, the faster it is. Or you can do things like phase oscillation as well, which I've covered in a previous video. But today I want to keep it kind of simple just because this sound didn't really need too much more to make it work. So I'm going to leave it on free rather than syncing it to a certain division of the song. And then I'm going to bring the rate down all the way to 0.10 Hertz. And we want this LFO to continue as we hold down the key. So we want to have it on retrigger so that it retriggers every time you press the key. And we don't want it on one shot. Otherwise it would just do one oscillation and then stop. So if we go ahead and press the yellow plus sign and map this to the gains of both of the oscillators, and then we're going to bring these up to around 25-ish%. Then we can have a listen and see what it does. As you can hear, the volume LFO is extremely slow right now, and that's for a reason. I'm going to want to automate the LFO to then start increasing in speed. So click next to the LFO and add an envelope, and this is going to be automating the rate of the LFO. So click on the yellow plus sign, and we're going to click right here where it says drag to modulate, and we're going to set this to a rate of 67%. So just click anywhere else to get rid of the modulation screen, and then we're going to edit the values on this envelope here. So we don't need a decay. We can bring the attack up like halfway. Just bring the curve down to -100. We also don't need a release. Now if we listen, you should hear that the LFO starts slow and then ends fast, and it sustains on the fast note. So this is almost done. We can add in one extra thing, which will be a pitch envelope, just to add a bit more kick at the start. So if we click here, add an envelope, and we're going to map this to the semi-cent here. Let's just bring this up a bit here. Now for a pitch envelope, I want to have no attack, otherwise the pitch is going to go low to high at the start. And then I don't want to have any sustain, because that means when I hold the note down, the sustain value is going to be where the pitch is. So if we listen now, you can hear the sub has just gone high, which is wrong. But if I bring the sustain down, you hear it's right now. Also, we don't really need a release, but as this is already on the 0 line here, because this is a unipolar, it doesn't really matter if it's long or not. So how much the pitch envelope is going to affect the sub is going to all be in this curve here, and then also the length of the decay here, and then the amount here. So it's just playing with those three values. Now we don't want it to be too punchy, so if we bring the amount up, you can kind of hear that lasery tone that we don't really want. So I'm going to bring it back down. I'm just going to play with this curve as well, just to make it a bit quicker. And that's just adding enough punch at the start of the sub so I can feel it in the sub pack, and you'll be able to feel it on the system in a club just to give that nice extra bit of punch there. This is a great way of adding weight and punchiness on a sub or bass on the notes that aren't coinciding with the kick drum where it's being sidechained. Because sometimes the sub can sound weak if you don't have any kind of pitch envelope on it, especially on the bits between the kick drum and the snare drum where there isn't any sidechain going on, masking that transient information. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to go to lane 3 and we're going to add in a limiter. That's just going to balance out that LFO and just make it not so aggressive. So in general, the settings are pretty good. You're just going to want to dial in the release and the output and the threshold a bit. Just trust your ears. This is a creative process. You know, you don't have to follow exactly what I'm doing. This is more of a, you know, tutorial on how to apply these different techniques. So if we just play along and listen. Sounding pretty good now. All right, I hope that helps you. I hope you can apply that onto your own kind of basses. I will include the patch down below if you want it. Also, if you want to get a sub pack, either the seated one or the M2X, then feel free to use my code Protostar for a 15% discount at checkout. And you can also use my code Protostar for a 10% discount on anything on Kilohearts store. So that includes PhasePlant or even a subscription bundle. Thanks to Kilohearts for sponsoring this video, and yeah, many more to come. So, bye.